if you write a draft constitution as an exile, I believe that you are articulating your participation in constituent power. Now you can reject that, but I think you should not, because I'm going to give a constructive reading of this. So if as an exile you feel that you partake of constituent power, then this creates a puzzle, because constituent power is an internalist mode of legitimation. The idea is basically that all those who are forced to live under a certain regime, to live under law, have a claim to participate in the making of this law. So the authors and the addressees should be identical, ideally. And my colleagues in democratic theory, they say that this is the all-subjective principle. All and only those who are subject to a system of laws should have a say in the making of these laws. And exiles abroad, at first glance, are not subject to these laws. And I now suggest to apply this idea, this puzzle, to partaking of constituent power, not of ordinary legislative power. And this means I can already go beyond my first slide, because, oh, this is not what I should do. Because only the last line is now relevant for what comes next. Despite this puzzle that I've just outlined, there's a huge fascination for outsiders participating in constituent power, from the Hebrews to the Greeks to Rousseau to Bentham. And so I'll start out by saying, what kind of features do exiles share with other outsiders who we read about in the literature on constituent power, and say, well, this is similar, but it's not the same. So exiles should not claim that they are getting involved in the same sense as other outsiders. And then I have 2 or 3 more constructive slides where I try to work out my own solution to the puzzle. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's legislator, as everybody knows, is the paradigm of the outsider who is taking part in constituent politics. And this outsider is a wise person, and her task is to unite a multitude to a people, and this multitude, these individuals, they are very inexperienced, and the legislator is very experienced, so I hope you don't recognize your role as exiles in this description of the Rousseauian legislator, but the idea is she needs to be very, very knowledgeable about history, geography, the climate, all these Montesquieuian ideas, but also about the customs and what has been going on in this country. And if she has the knowledge, then she can work out a draft constitution. But, and I want to ask the exiled drafters here to dissociate themselves from Rousseau's legislator, she has no part in constituent power, because the people themselves have the exclusive constituent power, and it's only their decision in the ratification process to adopt this constitution or to reject it. So there are some similarities, knowledgeability, empathy for what has been going on. People are very much informed, exiles are very much informed about history, customs, and so on. But they have a stronger claim. So we need to go further to the next person in the history of idea, who is Jeremy Bentham. And he has a twofold idea about outsider participation in constituent politics. And the first idea is that every country should have a competition for draft constitutions. Yeah? Imagine Putin doing this and saying, well, I would prefer foreigners to get involved in this competition, because foreigners are impartial, they don't have a stake, they're not going to live here. So in contrast to the all-subjective principle, they have the advantage of having no stake in the process. But like Rousseau, Bentham believes that the draft person, again, is not partaking of what he calls constitutive authority, but constitutive authority is assigned in the constitutional text to the people But the authority who adopts the constitutional text is the old legislature. So he has a very much non-revolutionary idea of the adoption of a new constitution. But there's a second element, and I think that's already going in the right direction, because in this chapter on constitutive authority, Bentham also has a section on what he calls the public opinion tribunal, and he says that we shouldn't imagine constitutive authority to be exercised without the outside intervention by people who are not citizens, who don't live there, but who are aware, who are cognizant of what's going on in this country, and therefore are not afraid to intervene in a discursive way. Yeah? But of course, although this is already a step further because they are complementing the constituent power on the ground, this is also not enough for the self-understanding of exiles who are drafting a constitution. What it does have in common with exiles is that from the outside, in a cosmopolitan mindset, you're communicating into a domestic sphere. Now, coming to the constructive proposal that I promised, we need to first define what an exile is. And Judith Sklar, who was herself an exile, has given this definition, which is more rough than ready, and it's quoted in the literature. Exiles are involuntary emigres who live under the threat of harm to themselves or to their families. And Vasanta Kumar, who is the best author in this area, has added, they may have been forced to flee. And I think this is already a good beginning because it shows that we need to link the discussion about exile and constituent power with the literature on historical injustice or transitional justice. Yeah? So there has been something that has been going wrong in the country, and some people have been driven out of the country. Now, can everybody who has been driven out of the country be counted among exiles and be bona fide drafter and participant in the Institute's project? No. Consider de Gaulle in London, Lenin in Geneva, Paris and London, Khomeini in Paris, but for our purposes, perhaps most drastically, Eduard Benesch in London in 1945, drafting an Owen-ready constitution as the representative of a government in exile. Now, I don't mean those. And I think I can exclude them here analytically because of this two-level politics that constituent power introduces. I'm interested in the question, who can claim authority to just articulate and exercise constituent power, but not strive for government power? And I believe that this is what all these other categories have in common. They do not bother to make a distinction that the exiles in the Institute made. We only want to articulate constitutional politics, but we do not search for power in ordinary politics. This is not our way to the government. So the next point, which I take from Vasanta Kumar, is you need to retain an orientation towards the political development of the home country, and I believe that this criterion is trivially fulfilled in the draft constitution project of the Institute, but I want to say that we mustn't tailor the category of the exile too narrowly. So consider, for example, Sklar or Hannah Arendt. I mean, they would fall under the definition of Sklar and Vasanta Kumar, but somebody like Leo Strauss would not. Somebody like Adorno would fall under the definition because he had been forced to flee, but somebody like C.J. Friedrich would not. Cassirer would fall under the definition, but we don't know whether Abi Warburg left Hamburg early enough to not fall under the definition. So what I want to say is there needs to be a historical context where at least some had to flee in order for others who may have emigrated for other reasons, who may not have been forced to emigrate, to count as exiles too. So that there can be a joint project by the persecuted and the non-persecuted because of a common understanding of the historical situation. And now I come to my interpretation of what this historical situation is. But first of all, consider the most skeptical view of exile intervention that is Lopez Guerra 2005 in an article, Should Expatriates Vote? He argues that, like tourists, no expatriate should have the vote, because then they would be electing governments but not being forced to live under the governments that they have themselves elected. And this is not the same case, because it's, again, normal politics, not constituent politics, but I think it gives us a sense of the problem that we are facing. We need some positive claim for exiles to continue to get involved, even in the hard cases. And the hard case is where they haven't decided whether they want to go back. So I recognize that this is kind of an answer that may seem very plausible. Yeah, well, they're planning to go back at some stage, but I don't want to force them analytically to have a commitment to go back if possible, because I think that would be completely unfair to the exile predicament. It would be obscene to build a theory on exile and constituent power that would only be working if the exiles were actually prepared to go back to where they had been persecuted. Yeah, take National Socialism. So what I want to say is that David Owen makes the next productive step in saying, well, Lopez Guerra is only partly right, because he is concerned with normal politics, but expatriates, he's not talking about exiles, all expatriates, they are actually subjected to the law of the home country in terms of what their citizen status means. And that can be changed, and they are still subjected. So I believe this goes in the right direction to separate constituent intervention from intervention in ordinary politics. But of course, this is much too narrow, because then exiles would be able to write a preface to a draft constitution talking about citizenship law, but they couldn't go on and saying interesting things about referenda and what have you, rights, transgressions, and so on. So the next step that we need to make, and I'm almost done, is to adopt an idea that comes from political liberalism. Rawls, Eckermann, Michelman, and now Alessandro Ferrara, they have created an interesting tradition which is decidedly giving a liberal interpretation of the constituent power, and this means they are predominantly interested in how the constituent power can be bound to certain liberal principles and what the most reasonable understanding of justice is for our community. But if you have some patience with that, I believe that we can use it for our purposes. Because the basic idea in Ferrara and other political liberals is that the people is the holder of the constituent power, and that the people is a trans-temporal subject, right? So you have these time slices, and he calls them the electorate. And the electorate is not bound historically, but the people is bound in making sense of a trans-temporal process of constitution making for themselves. And I want to say that in a certain respect, if not in more than one respect, exiles are involved in this understanding of the constituent power of a trans-temporal people, and this relates to, as I already suggested, to the dimension of historical injustice and countering historical injustice. Because Ferrara also makes this point that most constitutions have been made in an effort to overcome the historical injustice that has happened under the old constitution. So that you can hardly understand what's going on in constitution making. This is where the exile-specific competence and membership comes in. So that you can hardly understand what's going on in making the new constitution if you don't put yourself in the shoes of somebody who knows against which injustice this new constitution is now being erected. And now you could say, okay, why can't a cosmopolitan citizen, why can't Robin Chelicatis also put himself in the shoes of somebody who knows all that has been going on in Russia, right, and join this project. And here I take up a suggestion from Artemi, who wrote a blog post invoking Karl Jaspers. Karl Jaspers, famously the question of guilt, and everybody knows that he only has time for guilt when talking about criminals. He has a lot of time for other connections to the past regime of injustice, of normal citizens, of non-implicated citizens, and the main connection that imputes continuity between the old regime of injustice and the post-conflict constitution and its people is responsibility. So let me put my cards on the table. I would like to derive the authority to partake of constituent power in exile from the responsibility that you cannot invade responding to past injustice by your investment in drafting or whatever, working towards a new constitution. I know that philosophically speaking I may be on thin ice because the logic of my argument is ought implies may. But if you buy that, then I believe we have found a constructive solution to the puzzle whether exiles, though not subjected by the Constitution in the strict sense, should still be considered as having a stake and partake of the exercise of constituent power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you somehow alluded to that, but I just want to ask, are exiles actually outsiders? Because on the one hand, there is this right to vote for expatriates that you talked about, and exiles being citizens or expatriates being citizens of the home country are allowed to legally vote, including constitutional vote on constitutional amendment, which we all did, even though it didn't make any sense, but that is legally possible. But if that would still fall under the jurisdiction of the existing constitution, then the question of drafting a new constitution raises a question of constituting a whole new state altogether, where citizenship rights might be different as well. So then the question of who drafts the constitution, exiles or non-exiles, falls under the more general question of the continuity between the new constituted state and the previous one, and then that would there would be a different question of authority anyway.
So I would say that, of course, in a draft constitution, you can also draw up a new citizenship law. Yeah, so there's nothing that should keep you from doing this and getting involved in that. But the question from political theory is, should the old regime be entitled to ban you from voting in constitutional referenda if you're an expat or an exile? Yeah? And so my argument is covers this case, and it says no. Right? I don't make a hard and fast distinction, as David Deisenhaus will perhaps complain about later over dinner, between constituent power in making a new constitution and having the authority to have a say in constitutional amendments, if these constitutional amendments are quite important. But in response to your answer, I think it would not make a difference where I stood on this question. So I believe there are two kinds of outsiders: foreign outsiders and citizen outsiders. And my question is, which citizen outsiders have a claim in the continuous articulation and exercise of the constituent power? So would it be unjust towards them if they were excluded from future constituent referenda? I don't actually know what the current Russian legislation on this is. I mean, there are amendments all the time.
He's right. I mean, we all still have Russian passports.
Yes.
So technically, if there is a referendum, we have complete right to vote.
Even here, yeah, you don't have to, yeah. I mean, this is as should be. So for kind of incremental constitutional reform and constitutional amendment, which I think we should also let fall under constituent power, that would be enough. But I think that's something different from the kind of authority. And I don't mean the positive legal authority. I mean the political authority, the question of legitimacy, whether you should be entitled. I mean, Lopez Guerra writes this article and says, should expatriate Mexicans have the right to vote for the Mexican president? He says no. And so his argument is a bit like mine. Should expatriates, in this case exiles, have a claim, for example, to vote in constitutional referenda in their home country? And you could make a claim in the Lopez Guerra vein that they should not, because they will not be living under this.
Yes, Peter, this is a kind of follow-up. Do you make any distinction between exiles and refugees? Because refugees is a legal category in the United... So it is described as those who flee because of persecution for reasons...
Well, I do,
Exile is not really a legal category. I don't know if it's part of international law. So do you take into account that exile might describe a form of self-exile, a voluntary living? Because in the case of refugees, you are forced to live. So maybe there is a tripartite distinction that might be useful to your approach. Exile, the refugee, and the stateless person. And then under all these categories, who has the legitimacy or authority to participate in a constituent project? And this brings me to my second question. Since it seems that you approach the question of the constituent power from a liberal standpoint, and usually in liberal discussions of constituent power, there is always the question of the presence of representation. Why don't you take also this hypothetical argument that, yes, exiles have the right to participate, to exercise constituent power if they claim to represent the authentic constituent power that in any case will be represented from a liberal standpoint, because they don't want a more direct participation in the constituting process. So what if they claim, the exiles, that will represent the Russian people?
I don't see that
a kind of informal representation.
I don't see that liberalism comes into it too much. I take this transtemporal idea from a decidedly liberal conception of constituent power, but I think it's more like a democratic stakeholder idea, and in contrast to the stakeholder models that are on the market by Rainer Bauböck, I bring in Jaspers and bring in the element of responsibility. And so I don't really think, I mean, this is something that you can't avoid having. So it's not liberal, and it also doesn't distinguish between the more radical elements and the more liberal elements of the exile intelligentsia. So I'm not playing them off against each other. I'm putting them all in the same.
If you adopt the argument about representation, but in any case, the constituent power acts always after being or by being represented. Like, say, yes. Calls it extraordinary.
I think we can connect this discussion with the more recent debate about representative claims making. So what you do is you write a draft constitution, and in this, of course, you have to appeal to a certain imagined, not yet fully formed constituency in Russia. Who do I want to win over? Who is my addressee? And this can fail, and it can succeed. But what I want to say is that he can make this representative claim, unlike myself, on the basis of an authority to partake of constituent power, and I can't. So that's the distinction. That's the distinction I'm after. There's a specific authority that comes from the connection, the historical connection to a certain constitutional project which is transtemporal and which reacts to doing away with the injustice of the old regime. And the drafters, I want to say, under a certain conception of historical justice, have a responsibility, even if they have been totally blameless in their life in Russia. If there's nothing that you could say that makes them responsible for any of the injustices, that I don't know whether you disagree, whether you have a stake in these, but I want to say, I'm not saying they are in any sense to be faulted by implicating them with responsibility for this constitutional project. Yeah. If they shed this responsibility, they shed their claim to constituent power, and they shed their claim also to voting in constitutional referenda.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the attention to our case. Yeah, I do actually think that the Russian exiles bear responsibility, and it was not only a blog post, I also wrote an article in 22 where I argued that. But it's like Jasper's, it's not a legal criminal responsibility, but it's a moral responsibility. The question, or well, the comment or a question is that actually you are right that legitimacy is crucial there, and it's a big question that is discussed now in Russia, and it used to be discussed also with regard to those who stay in Russia, because the current demonstration democracy for the last 30 years has this kind of Achilles heel, that it's very open. It's an open system, but it is supposed to be a democracy of a sovereign nation. It's not supposed to be a cosmopolitan democracy. So the institutions are sovereign, but at the same time the process is open and cosmopolitan in this sense. And this creates this capacity for the government to say, look, but these people, they are participating in our politics, but they are really foreign agents. Because we know that they have funds from the West, or even like they repeat the ideas that they got from Professor Niesen in Germany. And they publish them in the Russian media. They are foreign agents. So their participation in Russian politics is illegitimate. By the way, the US politicians also make this argument. But constantly they find some foreign country that intervenes in their elections.
Elections, yes, but you also have the free speech law, which allows donations from outside the country in the US. So I think Israel and Russia have these foreign agents laws. And
America does. FARA, it's called.
Yeah, but we're talking about discursive influence, yeah? So that may also make a difference, yeah? But I can not open this can of worms here, because this is the question of the internationalized pouvoir constituant.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the question of whether people like Robin Shelikatis and myself, funded by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, yeah, should have a claim to consult in constitution-making processes. And I believe this is a completely different topic. Tonight, I've been talking about the special legitimacy of people who have left their country, either forced to flee, not stateless. That's a completely different subject, because, I mean, the literature on exile focuses on the stateless people because they need to integrate and can't in their new country. So they are homeless, yeah, Ben Habib, Arendt, klar. But what we are interested in is the people who still have one foot in the political development of their home country, and that's not the case for stateless people. Yeah, so I can't do anything with them, sorry.
Yeah, I agree with this. I understood your much more narrow and precise point. I'm just saying that an alternative argument would be that people who have a right to be involved should be people who are associated with certain universalist political forces.
It's Matthias Kumm, yeah, Cosmopolitan, Constituent Power, yeah.
Ah, really? Okay,
yeah, so I don't buy this, yeah.
No?
I mean,
okay.
You can use the term cosmopolitan in our context for two completely different things. One, the values of the people who are intervening into constituent processes abroad. That's what you had in mind. That's what Matthias Kumm does. Yeah,
yeah, the values.
Also here. And the second one is they don't have the nationality. And that's the case that I use, that Bentham uses, that Rousseau uses. So cosmopolitan intervention is non-citizen outsider intervention in constituent processes.